evening, everybody. Welcome to our Emotionally Healthy seminar. My name is Lou Richards and I lead the pastoral care team at Christchurch, London. I'm really excited this evening to be chatting to Dr. Kate Middleton. Kate is a psychologist. She is a director at the Mind and Soul Foundation, which seeks to educate the general public basically on all areas of mental health and well-being, and she is also involved in leading a church in Hertfordshire. So Kate, welcome.
It's so great to be with you.
Thank you. Just to say before we start, actually, before I forget, if you have questions that you want to submit over the course of this next hour, Kate would love to hear them and answer them. So do just write a comment in the box and one of our team will let me know and we can ask your question. So without further ado, let's start off at the basic level then. So what is stress?
I think that is such an interesting question and such a key question for this season, because for me as a psychologist, what I'm often talking about when I'm talking about stress, I become aware it's not the same as what other people talk about. And so often in our everyday speech and conversation, when we talk about stress, we're talking about something that is basically emotional distress. So someone will say, like, stop stressing out, don't get stressed. What they mean is you're in an emotional state. And that is a form of stress. It's definitely an expression of stress. Those emotions are on the same physiological system as the wider stress that we experience. But actually, as a medic and as a psychologist, my understanding of stress is that anything that requires our body or our brain to act and react, anything that places demand on our system is a stressor. It's a stress because it triggers that physiological system. So your stress system, which is hugely complex and involves body and brain and lots of different hormones and organs and all sorts of things, is all about modulating your ability to respond to whatever life is throwing at you in the moment. So some of our most stressful times in life are actually the most amazing times. And in my work pre global pandemic, when I was talking about stress, I would almost always be talking to people in situations where they loved what they did. They were doing like really high power demanding jobs. They were often juggling it with families. They were volunteering, doing work in their evenings and weekends. They loved it all. They didn't want to stop any of it, but they were struggling with stress. And that misunderstanding around, like, well, I'm not distressed, so how can I be stressed? Is often something that once you can get past that, it really helps your understanding of what's going on and why this is affecting you the way it is. And of course, the pandemic and lockdown has been a really unusual situation for us all in terms of how it's affected our stress system.
Massively. And I mean, that's really interesting. Often you can think, or I might think that stress, you know, if you're stressed, it's a bad thing. But as you say, sometimes you can be doing something you really enjoy and be stressed. So how would someone know if they were experiencing stress, that, I guess, an unhealthy level of stress?
Yeah, well, as you say, like most things in terms of how your body and your brain respond, a little bit of stimulation is a good thing, as you say, and your stress system enables you to manage demand better. So it makes sure that you're focusing your attention, that you're ready to react, that you've got whatever you need to have, and interact with some of your emotional system to make sure that you're focusing your attention wherever you need to in the moment, that you don't miss anything. When we're really on it, that's what our brain and our body do. They work together to make sure we're ready for whatever is required. And I guess you can think of your stress system, it's quite a general way of talking about it, but think of it as a bit like the water level in a pool. So if you think one of the really important concepts with your stress system is where your baseline is. So if you imagine you're standing in a pool and that you can't see my feet, they're down here somewhere, but you imagine that the water level is down by your feet, and the everyday challenges of life are a bit like waves in that pool. And when your baseline is really low, your capacity to cope with them is absolutely fine. And even if life gets busy and that baseline rises a little bit, your capacity, those everyday waves are still well within the safe zone, if you like, even as the water level rises, maybe even up to the middle of that zone. So that the increase in your stress sort of system, the sort of triggering of that system is a good thing because it enables you to respond well. The problem is that we all have a crisis point, and that's literally where the water level sort of got up to here. You're starting to get to the edge of your capacity to handle what life is throwing at you, and that's a physiological reality in terms of your body and how much you can just keep going. You need to rest. You're not designed to run long term under heightened levels of that system. It's supposed to be a short term response, but it's also your mind. We're not cyborgs. I wish we were, but there's only a certain amount that we can cope with. And again, your brain gets tired. And so when you get to this point on your stress system, particularly if that's a baseline moment, so that can happen just on a really bad day. You know, we've all had days like that where just everything goes wrong and just suddenly you think, okay, everybody just needs to go away for a minute. But also longer term, what can happen in seasons when we're really busy or when life is unusual or something crazy like lockdown happens is that our stress level is raised long term and our baseline ends up sitting really quite close to that overwhelm point. And when you're there, when you're living in that zone, it's a bit like the classic thing about if you drop a frog into hot water, it jumps out, but if you put it in cold and heat it gradually, you know that old story. And I think the thing is that is a gradual change. Usually lockdown is unusual, but usually that's a gradual thing. And so what you just suddenly become aware that that's where you're living, and that is a very uncomfortable place. And some people they become aware of it because of the physical impact, and that might be a short-term physical impact because some people's bodies just don't tolerate raised levels of that stress system very well. So you might get issues with your gut, headaches, muscle tension, things like that. Sometimes it's a longer-term physical reaction because the triggering of that system changes things like the level of sugar in your blood, how reactive your cells are to that sugar, because it's about making sure you're ready, the fight or flight response that you all have heard about. And if that is how you're living long term, that's not good for you. And so some of these physical problems can be the impact of long term heightened stress. But very often what it is it's a brain response, or it is an emotional response, because, as I say, emotions, particularly like anxiety and frustration, are on the same physiological system. They're very closely linked with our stress system. And when you're living this close to overwhelm, what you find is that emotionally you start to feel very close to the level where you can't handle it, and emotions like anxiety and frustration start to bubble over all the time, and you find yourself suddenly very reactive, really struggling. And those little waves, which normally wouldn't bother you at all, the little things that life just throws, you know, you drop a mug or you forget to do something or you mess something up, and you would normally just think, oh well, but suddenly become really hard to manage. And people will say literally, I feel like I'm going under. And it is, and at the same time you'll start to experience things again, both physically from your body, emotionally, but also your brain, your thinking patterns, little shooting thoughts like I can't cope, I need to get away, I've got to get out of here, because your brain is trying to get you to get to a space where that level can drop back down. And so it becomes increasingly uncomfortable for us to live in that space. And I think when you're there, and particularly over a longer period, a lot of people have, and so particularly at the end of lockdown, a lot of people have been saying things to me like, I just don't feel like myself. And very often what's happening, it isn't that you've changed, you haven't become some kind of Frankenstein version of yourself. It's just, this is what it looks like when we're living under extreme stress for a long period of time. And so many people have been in that space on and off or over longer periods of time in lockdown because of the nature of that season.
I relate to so much of what you're saying. And I mean, I've noticed both in myself and the people around me, or even just passing in the street, there's an element of solidarity, especially at the beginning of lockdown, but there's also this kind of impatience with other people. And I've noticed it. I can, whether it's with my kids or other people, it can feel like lots of us are going around with a short fuse, or it doesn't take much to suddenly feel really anxious or just completely thrown. And I know that even with the changes in the government legislation about numbers of people meeting today, I've had so many conversations where, even though it's not entirely unexpected, it's just thrown us.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because what basically happens when you're on the edge of overwhelm is that your brain goes into a kind of emergency mode. It's a bit like, when the aeroplane's landing and they turn off all the lights except the really essential ones. So it genuinely does change the way that your mind works, which is kind of weird. That's why you feel so much like you're not quite yourself. And there's lots of ways that you see that change sort of in terms of how we experience it ourselves. And one of those is that your brain basically tries to bring everything back to a much simpler way. The human mind likes certainty, and it likes to live under the illusion that life is fairly certain and that we can control it. And goodness, haven't we found out that isn't the case? But when you're in that emergency mode, your brain tries to simplify things, and so you start to think in a very binary way. So things are either one thing or another, either black or white. And the grey, which in the reality is the messy zone where most of life exists, it feels like that's just not there. And so the sorts of things that our perception changes would be things like, are you on my side or are you against me? Are you right or are you wrong? Am I right or am I wrong? Have I done this well? Was that successful, or am I a total failure? And the nature, because of the season that we're under, particularly because we're feeling it's relentless and we're feeling quite under attack, there's a lot of fear and anxiety around, means that we're more likely to go to the negative side of all those binary choices. So we're much more likely to interpret maybe a fairly innocent comment, normally something that we would just think, oh, well, they're being a bit snarky today. But when you're close to overwhelm like that, you just think, they're against me, they're attacking me. And we respond as though we were being attacked. So when you're in that space, the potential for conflict and for people to be really prickly is much higher. And of course, we are emotionally more hypersensitive because our emotions are much more close to the surface, so that we don't handle those little triggers as well at all. And I think all of that within a context where there's lots of change and where there's lots of difficulty around decision making and understanding of all these different rules and regulations, it does mean there's a lot of potential for conflict. People are very shouty. I mean, I'm a big time cyclist. I love to bike, and I cannot tell you how many people have shouted at me in the last 6 months. And believe me, I have not become a worse cyclist in the last 6 months, but I've had people literally winding their window down to yell. Somebody chased me down the road just to yell at me, and it's almost a relief when we find a space where we can let out some of this tension and frustration.
If we're trying to hold it in other contexts, it's a bit like road rage, isn't it? Suddenly you get in the car and everyone's annoying you.
Frustration is such a difficult emotion as well, because it is so physically held and it does literally get pent up. And it's as well as stress. I think one of the things that many of us have had to deal with within lockdown has been some of the emotional challenge, and frustration has definitely been one of those. Like, where do you let that out? Because you're holding so much frustration.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've just tuned in, then welcome. I am chatting to Dr. Kate Middleton this evening about the subject of stress. We're having a great conversation. So we've been talking about what stress is and what it looks like. And so I guess we've been talking about the fact that a number of us, well, all of us pretty much, have been under an extended period of stress over the past kind of 6-7 months when it comes to what's going on with a global pandemic. So given that is the nature of what's going on, what are some strategies that can help us maybe bring that kind of baseline of the water level down a bit? Do you have some?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting to chat about there, before I go into some practical stuff, is why have we been so stressed? Because it's a conversation I've had with a lot of people. And I think particularly if you've been in a position where actually lockdown for you has been flipping boring, maybe you were furloughed, you've not been able to work, you've been stuck at home, particularly if you're living on your own, that the challenge of just what do I fill my days with has been the big issue for some people. So a lot of people I'm talking to are saying, like, but why I have nothing to be stressed about, believe me, I've got nothing to do. And I think what's really important is to understand how your mind keeps that baseline low. And one of the things that's really important is your regular rhythm and routine. So normally in normal life, if we can even remember what that was now. We all had a basic rhythm and routine, and there were aspects of each day that were repeated every day. Monday to Friday, or whatever your normal pattern was largely the same. There were things you did every day, whether that's, making your first cup of coffee in the morning, whether it's the bus you catch for work, taking the kids to school, whatever that is. And you can think of that, the sort of challenges of every day is a bit like climbing a wall, and that routine is like the handholds in the wall. And when you're in that position of just normal everyday life, you can do that climb really without thinking about it. So it takes a huge amount of demand off your brain, because you don't have to think about most things. We've all done that thing where you drive one of your standard routes and you get there and realize that you didn't really think about the journey at all. You totally zoned out, or you've driven to the wrong place. I've done that so many times, like, because I'm actually not going to work that day, but that is where I drive. And that is exactly what your brain's doing. It's going onto automatic pilot, which means the demand is really low. But what happened in lockdown uniquely was this utter destruction of all of those routines and rhythms. All just went literally overnight. And there's a psychologist called Dr. Rowena Hill, who's on one of the government panels, and she talked about the unique nature of this season affecting everyone, everywhere, in everything. And it just took all of that out. So we were all suddenly in a position where actually there's none of those handholds are there, and maybe you're climbing the same wall, or actually often the wall has totally changed. There's new boulders, new challenges, things that weren't hard before suddenly become a huge deal. How do you get shopping? How do your kids aren't in school, you can't go to work, So I think for everyone, our stress level immediately jumped up. And every time we experience a new change, and going back to new normal, some people might feel like actually we're starting to get back into a bit of a rhythm and routine. It's such a relief. And that's why it is literally a relief for your brain, because it can stop thinking about all this stuff. But it isn't normal, is it? And every time we think we're getting there, something else changes, and whoop, up goes your stress level again. And I think it's really important as well to understand that if you were in a position where actually what you lost was all your productivity, all the things you normally did, that is hugely stressful. Like the challenge to your mind of thinking, what am I going to do with every day? Or the stress. One of the things that we've come to understand so much better really just in the last decade is how stressful isolation and loneliness is. The human brain needs other people. So if you've been in a position where for an extended period of time you've had very little contact, physical contact, we know triggers natural hormones that drop your stress level. So even now, we're not able to hug, we're not able to have that physical contact. We've lost some of the natural modulators of stress. So bearing all that in mind, that helps us understand what are some of the things we can do to try and manage our stress level. So things like, where can you put back in a rhythm, a routine? What are the stepping stones in your week that you can start to get back into place? Or even in seasons where I know some people might be sitting watching this in areas where they're under local lockdown, where things again have gone much closer to what it's been like at the height of lockdown. Even in those moments, are there aspects of your normal routine that you can keep? So if you normally have a Monday team meeting at work, can you still do that but do it on Zoom? So that there's something of that regular rhythm that's still there. When kids were being homeschooled, let's hope that doesn't have to happen again. As a mom, can I just say? But the advice was to try and stick to a regular routine if you can, and I know we did that, and it really helped. And that's why, because if you can give your brain that predictable pattern, it will help. But also, I think we've got to be aware and just accept that we are under higher stress. So whereas normally we might not have to be as proactive about what are the things we're doing to manage stress, to drop that stress level, literally the things that pull the plug out so that water level can drop. In this season, we are going to have to be really intentional, really proactive, really careful about those things. And some of those will be in the moment responses. So something has just happened, or life has, and you suddenly, you have those moments. I know I have them as a mum, and just doing things, you just think, I am about to lose it. Honestly, my capacity to respond like a sensible adult is about to go out of the window. I had to confess to my family that over lockdown I broke our Alexa because of a moment like that, where it was the final straw. In a bad moment, I went in and the flipping thing wouldn't pick up the Wi-Fi, and I picked it up and slammed it down on the counter, and it's never worked again. So when you're in those moments, sometimes it's a short-term thing of saying, do you know what? I need to take a breather. I need to go sit on the back step and have a cup of tea. I need to get out, or I need to go to a room where nobody else is. I need to just get somewhere where there's the stimulation level is dropped and I can just calm down. Maybe there are even some breathing exercises, some things that we can do in those moments, putting on a favorite song. There's things that you can do in those moments that physiologically drop your stress level quickly. So there's in the moment responses, but there's also longer term things. So what are the things you do that keep you sane, that drop your stress level? So I am a biker. One of the reasons I bike is because it drops my stress level. It helps me cope. So through lockdown, I was so glad that I was still able to do that. And I did it almost every day, just getting out, even if it's just 45 minutes, because that's something I do that helps me manage my stress level. So, and a lot of people who've never had to even think about this before have found themselves having to explore really intentionally, like, what do I actually do that's relaxing? And either because you just never had to think about it before, or because the nature of this season is the stuff you would normally do, you can't do. If you normally go kick a ball around with mates, or play golf, or, go to a choir, or, whatever it is that you do, book club, and all of these things that just haven't been able to happen, you're going to have to find some new ways, and you might have to find them quickly.
And I guess a lot of the alternatives, I found at least, have been Zoom events.
Oh, my goodness.
They're great, but so many people I've spoken to, and me myself, get Zoom fatigue, where you just don't really you want to connect with someone in person and you just can't, and that can be so frustrating.
And it's really interesting in terms of your stress level, because it is so cognitively demanding. So, but because having a conversation is so much harder, reading the little visual cues that would normally be instinctive and automatic becomes really deliberate. Little things like, where do you look? How do you manage that? It's incredibly hard to do that. It's really hard work, focused attention, but also because for a lot of people it's very emotionally triggering. Some people find having their own picture on screen really difficult. The frustration elements, not being able to work the flipping technology, and also something that we psychologists call dissonance, which is where there's a clash. And so Zoom is a really interesting type of dissonance, because it's like, it feels like I'm having a conversation with you now, Lou, but we're actually not physically in the same space. So my brain is trying to hold those two weird realities that totally conflict. And actually, all of that is really stressful, isn't it? And it's just oddly relentless as well, Zoom, isn't it?
It is.
And I definitely had a moment in lockdown. There was a moment where I'd actually finished a day of work and I went into the kitchen to cook dinner, and my daughter was just starting a Zoom dance class. And I heard, that ding dong when you join. And I had this whole body stress reaction just to that noise. And it was like a bomb had gone. It's just like, I cannot take any more of that today. Yeah. And it was a really interesting moment, just thinking, gosh, that stuff is so stressful.
We've had a few questions already. Some of them, I guess you've answered from our conversation so far. But so someone asked about life habits that will help prevent stress. Good place or way to release pressure. I guess you talked about the cup of tea, listening to a song or something, and obviously you gave your Alexa story, which I think we can all relate to. Are there any other ways that you can suggest that where we can release some of that anger, I guess?
So and I think the question that you mentioned, how can we prevent stress? And I think the uncomfortable reality right now is that we can't. And perhaps in a unique way, we are all having to get really good. Some people, because of their jobs or lifestyle, always have had to learn really good techniques and routines to manage high stress, but we're all in that zone, so we're kind of on a steep learning curve here. How do you respond to it? How do you modulate it? And the good news is that studies looking at stress do show that on the whole, how well we respond to stress is not just about the sheer amount of stress we're under. It is about how do you act? How do you react? How do you process it? How do you release tension and things like that? So we can all get better at this, and we can improve things dramatically, I think, when you understand the impact, why you're stressed, that you are stressed, and therefore start to do something about it. That can help an awful lot, particularly with some of the things that a lot of us are finding emotionally difficult right now, like frustration and anxiety. So there's you can kind of think in categories, and I encourage people to be really quite exploratory about how they manage stress, because everyone is different. You know, something that one person would find hugely relaxing would drive someone else utterly crazy. You know, like puzzles, for example. Like loads of people love puzzles. I just can think of nothing that would stress me out more than trying to do a puzzle right now. It's like, are you trying to push me over the edge? No way. But I know loads of people who in lockdown have discovered this love for puzzles. You have to be quite analytical and find out what works for you. But there are some broad categories that are interesting. So I think things that are physiologically relaxing are interesting. So things like having a hot bath, sort of literally things that involve you sort of lying down or sitting down. So sometimes watching TV or reading, things that you are physically resting. Even exercise. If you exercise for long enough at a high enough level, so about 40 minutes or so of reasonably intense exercise, you'll release endorphins, which are your body's, they're a natural chemical in your body, and one of the things they do is they drop your stress levels. So things like that are naturally physiologically relaxing are really interesting. So that's definitely one category to explore. Things that are distracting are very interesting. Sometimes what we just need is to get away in our heads from COVID and the relentless media stuff and everything that's going on. So film, cinema, books, some types of crafts, playing a musical instrument. Often the value of those is that they're distracting. Sometimes you have to be careful, though, about a clash between those two. So, for example, one thing that I come across a lot is people who, as a response to stress, play video games.
Yeah.
Particularly like killing zombies is very cathartic if you've had a frustrating day. As far as I understand, I'm a bit rubbish at them, so I'm not sure that it would have the same effect for me. But the problem with that can be that it's actually physiologically really quite triggering for your mind. So again, what I've found in this season is a lot of people finding that as a go-to thing actually is not helping, and that they're starting to be like, this is weird. I'm actually feeling freaked out by something that used to be really positive for me. Because they're so close to overwhelm, they just can't cope with killing zombies. It's too much. So I think there's an interesting balance between those two things. But
it's also there are other unhealthy ways of trying to distract yourselves from stress. I know that I look at my phone too much, and I know that if I'm feeling overwhelmed, I can just start, scrolling on Instagram, and that's not the healthiest approach either.
Yeah, and I mean, there are some very interesting figures starting to come out, for example, around drinking and alcohol, saying that, I think I read a stat today that 50% of people are drinking significantly more now than they were pre-lockdown. And that's a classic thing that many of us after a stressful day will reach for a glass of wine. And in the short term, as part of a whole package of things we do, that there's nothing terrible with that. But if that's the only thing you know what to do, and a lot of people have probably found themselves instinctively reaching for that because this is just crazy. What do you do? I need to get away and I need the release. And actually, one of the challenges of lockdown is this isn't a short-term acute crisis. I mean, we're 6 months in now, and I'm sorry, but it's still going. So we've got to think of some longer term strategies that are going to work, and think about things. So the puzzle thing, that's another interesting category. So restoring order. So one of the things that the human mind loves is, as I say, certainty, a sense of feeling and control, but also order. We find most people find chaos quite difficult. We all have a different sort of trigger point. Some people can handle chaos more. So I'm very bad with chaos. I like things to be ordered and calm and controlled. Some people manage it better. But this season, everything is so chaotic. An awful lot of people are finding things that help them feel a sense of restoring order are soothing, oddly soothing, which I think is where the puzzles comes from. And maybe if I wasn't so rubbish at them, I would actually find that helpful. I find it oddly soothing because, and like there's a joke I have with one of my best friends. If she's saying like, "How are you, Kate?" I will just be like, "Well, I've already cleaned the fridge." Because I don't know why, but I do just feel like the world is a less terrifying place if my fridge is clean.
Yeah, I get that.
that disorder and chaos, it's just like that could push me over the edge on a bad day. I think there are interesting categories of things that we can do and look at and try things out. But we do have to get to know ourselves and what works, and sometimes play with the things. So sometimes if you're one of those people with a very active mind, then just doing something that's physiologically relaxing drive you crazy. Some people are very active relaxers. You have to be doing something. Again, it's why I bike. I get into the zone, and there's something almost hypnotic about that space where I'm in the zone. If I just sat on the sofa and tried to relax, I would drive myself crazy.
And that's really reassuring that is okay to be like that, and you're not bad at relaxing just because you don't want to sit there doing nothing.
No, and I think a lot of people say, oh, no, I've tried a relaxation technique. I tried a breathing exercise. It was a disaster. I couldn't do it, so I'm rubbish at that. But learning to relax is much more complex than that. And actually doing something really deliberate and intentional, like some of the exercises you might have come across, is really hard. And it is a new skill. So I do teach some of those, but I teach them very gradually. And I often say to people, the first time you try that, shouldn't be in a moment where you're like literally about to blow because you are so tense and the entire world's gone crazy. We have to try things that are a bit easier first and gradually learn skills of how to relax. So breathing is a very interesting thing to talk about in terms of relaxation, because we know that actually our breathing pattern has a huge influence over the levels on that physiological stress scale. One of the things we do as part of ramping that scale up is we breathe more, and we breathe more shallow. It's part of the fight or flight response. And there's a sort of what we call a feedback loop, which means that when you're breathing like that, it also ramps up the system even more. So it kind of keeps it maintains a height of that system, so that if you were in a situation where the demand was potentially high, or there was the potential for something you might need to react to, you stay in the zone. But when we're in a position like this, that's not helpful. And what we can do therefore is the opposite. So if you're breathing much deeper, much slower, lots of breathing out, then what you can do is actually drop your physiological system. So we can play with that either by learning breathing techniques or by doing something like singing or humming, because when you sing or hum, you naturally change your breathing pattern. This is why joining choirs and things like that has become so popular, because it does help you to moderate your stress level. And so that for a lot of people is much easier than trying to do something where you're actually focusing on your breathing. One of the weird things about breathing is the minute you don't normally think about it. And for some people in particular, focusing on breathing and thinking about it makes them start to feel quite panicky. But finding a favorite song and having a good sing along to it, joining an online choir, because they are online these days, or humming a good tune or whatever, get in the shower, have a good sing along, whatever it is that you do, that can be incredibly relaxing. And there's good physiology behind that and why that.
That's really interesting. We've just got a question. What can you do if someone close to you is stressed and the stress can rub off on you? That's a biggie, isn't it? Because there's an extent to which we might be able to control our own response, but what do we do when it's someone else?
And stress is contagious.
Yeah.
Those of us who've sat exams over the years, or maybe, I don't know if there's young people watching who are in exam years right now, you know, if you hang out with people just before an exam who are freaking out, you start to freak out. It is a bit catching. And I think particularly for those of us who are in a position where we are caring for other people, so particularly children and young people, but also sometimes more elderly relatives who are more vulnerable emotionally because they know that their degree of vulnerability and risk in this season is higher, or just because they're less able to be in control of their lives, or all sorts of reasons. That people who are dependent on us, they will take their emotional cues from us. So parents will often say to me, you know, my kids or my teens are freaking out, they're stressed, what do I do? And they want me to talk about all the things that they do for their kids. But actually often the first thing I will say is, how about you? Because the more stressed you are, the less well you will handle things. And if you're shouty, if you're like me, breaking Alexas, you're going to stress out the people who are around you. But also they will look to you, particularly younger children, so up to sort of mid-adolescence, they literally take their emotional cues from you because they don't know how the world works yet. Is this okay? Is it not okay? And there is this wonderful phase, really. My son's still in it, just he's 8, where basically if I'm calm, he's calm. The world is okay. And in some ways, the most distressing thing for him and some of our younger kids in lockdown has been, because we're all thrown into this high stress situation and we're all in it together. Our kids have seen some of us as adults pushed to a point they've never seen us before. I don't think my kids have ever seen me acting and reacting like I have done at some points in breakdown, or my husband, because it's been really hard. And that's been stressful for them. So sometimes the best thing you can do to help other people is help yourself. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
The other thing that we can do, again, if we are in a position where we have influence and control over things like rhythm and routine, is we can build that stuff in. So children and young people don't know how to manage stress. They don't know that going out for a walk will help to drop their stress level. Connection with nature, there's another big category we didn't talk about things that just naturally drop your stress level. There's something about getting out into the outdoors when you're able to, and I know we can't always do it throughout lockdown. Some people in particular who are shielding haven't been able to do that. And that might be going out for a walk, or it might be something as simple as sitting by an open window and just feeling the breeze on your face. I often say to people, just, can you get somewhere where you can see the sky? Look at the stars, that experience of awe, recognizing the wider world that we're in. We know that drops stress level. So we can teach things like that to some children, young people, some of the people who are dependent on them, and we can help them build that stuff into their routine. We can even talk to them about what stress is. How does that link to your emotions? Why are they feeling so weird? Where's that coming from? Particularly for children, it's so frightening when everything just feels different and weird and they don't know why, but we can take a lot of the fear out of it. When we don't understand why something's happening, we take the initial thing, which is hard anyway, and then we add one or both of two things. We either add fear, because it's like, why is this happening? What's going on? Have I changed? Has mum, dad changed? Why? Or we add guilt, like, I shouldn't be feeling like this. If I was a better person, if I was a better mum, I would not have broken my Alexa. Actually, that probably is true. But we pile guilt on ourselves, and we feel like we live in this superhuman culture that does say we should be able to handle everything, get everything right. Remember, your brain's gone super binary. So in those moments where you feel like you're failing at everything, you're probably not. It's probably not as bad as it feels. Your ability to perceive success and failure has just got messed up.
That's so important to recognise, isn't it? Because
understanding changes so much.
So, that feels like such a game changer for me, because also with the black and white thinking, I don't know about you, but I find I can often think I'm the only one who would think like that, and I wouldn't necessarily think that it's a problem that lots of people face, which normalises a bit. And because there's so much to process, it's easy to think, oh, there's something wrong with me, or other people are dealing with this better than I am. And so just kind of normalizing and talking about some of these things are so important.
Yeah. And processing, that's such a good point, Lou, because in this season, particularly, there is so much to process. And in August, I was talking to people a lot about this, because they were saying to me, like, I should be feeling so much happier. What's wrong with me? Why am I not happy now? Because I can get back to doing some stuff, but I'm not enjoying it. And so many people were finding, having come out of that acutely difficult season, that their brain is like, right, okay, we need to figure out, what on earth does this mean? What you've just been through, the impact it had on your life, your rhythm, your routine, the things that you always thought were absolutely stable and you could depend upon, your friendships, your relationships, and your brain is like, we need to process this. And actually that is stressful, it's emotionally demanding, it's tough. And now the season we're in, a lot of people are still trying to do that, but also we've got the next batch of changes, the next batch of unpredictability and uncertainty. And that's hard. And again, it's stressful, it's demanding, it's exhausting.
It really is.
To lie on the floor for a while and just hope everything goes away.
And there's so much change that people are facing, both with what's going on with lockdown and everything, but also people's circumstances. I'm thinking of people that might have lost loved ones, or people who may have lost their jobs, or who financially are struggling, long-term health conditions. I guess my question is around how we manage change and how, if this stress is unavoidable, what can we do practically around managing change like that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think to some degree it is about recognition and understanding. So being aware of those stress spikes and just allowing yourself to hold those without panic and without guilt. So saying like, actually, it's okay. There are elements of this season now that mean there will be moments where you just have overwhelmed moments, and thinking that's what's happening, and I know what to do. Literally having in your mind a sort of list of options, like how can I? Here's 5 things I can do if I have an overwhelmed moment, and in those moments thinking, which one can I do? Can I, like I often say to people, like even just like nipping to the loo, just grabbing a moment in a cubicle or in the loo at work or at home or wherever, where you can literally just, sometimes it only takes a minute just to drop the level back down, and then you can go back and you'll handle things better. We don't do ambush very well as human beings, and sometimes it can feel where you're close to overwhelm, like suddenly you're ambushed. So I think recognizing and responding well in the moment to stress spikes, that thing of building more routine in. But I think dealing with change and giving ourselves time and space to process it is really important. One thing that we can do that is often very helpful is getting things out of your head, because it's a bit of a double whammy. One of the things that when you're close to overwhelm cognitively, so how in terms of how your brain works, that is really affected is your ability to hold things in your memory and focus your attention. And so losing those things, forgetting things or losing track of things in your mind then raises your stress level even more. And actually, it's a bit like if you go to the supermarket and you've got like 5 things to get, but you've not written them down because you've only got to get 5 things. And I've done this so many times. What you end up doing is, as you're going around, you have to recite them, don't you? Because otherwise you're going to come out of there and realize you forgot one of the things you went in to get. So you're walking around going bread, milk, eggs, butter, cereal, whatever it is you've got to get. And you're having to keep going over and over and over. And that's demanding. It's quite tiring. It's, and if you wrote those things down, you would then release your mind from the demand of having to do that, because you could just get, oh yeah, I'll get the piece of paper out and I'll tick them off. Have I done it? And we can do that in seasons of high stress and change and high demand in all sorts of different things. So one of the classic things that stress and overwhelm affects is sleep, for example, because if you're on the edge of overwhelm, your brain is like, really? Do you really think you could switch off now? What if something bad happens? So we're naturally going to find it harder to switch off, get to sleep. We wake more easily. When we do wake, your brain kicks in and starts whirring straight away. Now, one of the things that has been shown to help with that as a really simple intervention is writing things down before you go to bed. What are the things I've got to think about for tomorrow? What are the things on my mind right now? And you might think, well, it doesn't make any difference putting them on a piece of paper, Kate, but it does, because what it does is it says to your brain, it's okay, you can let this go. You don't need to keep it at the front of your mind. And if you haven't done that, then just like when you're walking around the supermarket, it's your brain has to keep it constantly cycling around your working memory. Yeah. You've actually said it's okay, you can let that go, you can forget it. And in times when we are close to overwhelm, the action of trying to keep things in your working memory is so much harder. When you're exhausted, it's so much harder that those things become even more important.
It's actually really helpful to know the reason. I've read before things like, oh, write things down. But it's really useful to understand why. So now I totally get it. And it makes total sense to write something down. So, that's really helpful. We've just had a question that I'm really glad someone's asked, because it's a really important one. And that's, how do you know if your level of stress is normal or whether it's anxiety that you're struggling with and that you should perhaps get extra help for?
Okay, that is a really good question. So thanks to the person who asked that. And I think anxiety is a really interesting thing to talk about. And I know you've talked about it on one of the previous sessions, because at its root, anxiety is not an illness. It's a normal human emotion. But in seasons like this, or in times of high demand, anxiety can become really problematic, and it can start to make us ill, and it can start to interfere with everyday life. It can start to have an impact on us, on other people, that is really negative. And so I think, in terms of stress or anxiety, because they're very closely linked, they're on the same system, I think those are the questions we need to ask. Are we getting to a point where actually this is starting to have a really negative impact on me? Is it stopping me from being able to do things? Is it making me do things that are not positive, that might be having negative incomes for me or for other people? And I think those are the sorts of questions where you start to get into a space where maybe it's good to have a conversation with someone and say, like, I'm struggling a bit. What do you think? And I think our attitude to things like stress, anxiety can sometimes be a bit, I think it's good to reframe how we're thinking, like, why are you having that conversation? Why are you going to ask for help? Not so you can get this label of like, actually, I now have a stress problem, or I have an anxiety problem. I'm ill, there's something wrong with me. That's back to the guilt or the fear thing. But to say, actually, I am recognizing that in this moment, because of what life is doing, I've got to this space where I'm beyond my capacity to manage it, and that's really hard. So are there some things that might help and that might avoid? Because if we push through and try to live life in that overwhelm zone, literally, like I say to people, sometimes it's like living underwater. Then if we try and push through, sometimes the impact of that can be devastating, because it does lead us to get into unhealthy things, because we're trying to sustain a level of stress and anxiety that's horrible and that's unsustainable, or because the long-term impact on us is really bad. And the reality is we are all human, we all have limits. And, burnout is a real thing. It happens, and it can happen very suddenly. So many people live right on the edge of burnout all the time, and our attitude can so often just be like, have I burned out? No, I haven't, so it's all fine. Like, gosh, I came close, but that wasn't, like, I often joke to myself, like, is this how I'm going to have my total breakdown? This moment, is this it? No, I seem to have survived, it's okay. But joking aside, there comes a point where actually you're living on the edge of something that it does happen. You are human, and we think about that as something that will happen to someone else, to other people. But the reality is it could happen to me. It could happen to you. And if I start to think I'm immune from that and it wouldn't happen to me, then that's a very risky way to live. So sometimes actually recognizing, saying, gosh, I'm in that zone where I'm starting to struggle, and maybe there's some help that would get me through this better. That's a good conversation to have.
Yeah. I just want to share one of the things that has really helped me, because actually it's interesting you talk about burnout, because I actually got to that point where I was burnt out, and I suffered with postnatal depression, which was a really difficult time. And after I recovered from the depression, what I realized was that my boundaries weren't very good, in a way that I wasn't looking after myself very well. I was saying yes to people all the time when I should have said no, and then I ended up resenting them because it felt like they were exploiting me, when it was just the fact that my boundaries weren't great. And I was going to mention the STEPS course anyway this evening, because we've got an introduction coming up tomorrow. But I did the STEPS course, and I actually worked on people pleasing and fear of rejection, which was one of the contributing factors to me being stressed for so long, because I was just taking on too much of the time. And so I did the STEPS course. It was a 12-week recovery course where I was able to process some of what was going on and why I was doing it. And with the 12 steps, you kind of look at it. I know that you'll know all about it, but it's that kind of admitting your powerlessness and giving that over to God or a higher power, and then making amends and creating new rhythms. And that was just so helpful for me in terms of how I manage stress. And I wanted to give that example anyway, but it just so happens we do have an introduction 4 steps tomorrow at 1:00 or 7:30, which anyone watching is so welcome to be at. You don't have to believe in God to do it. It's really accessible for anyone. And it is a way of building in kind of routines where you can begin to look after yourself and address sometimes some of the underlying reasons why on the outside maybe you might feel like you're really stressed or running around like a headless chicken or just living at a constant state of exhaustion. So that was really helpful to me. And I know, I guess, things like meditation and prayer and I guess, kind of stillness can be really helpful for people, can't it? And
Sure.
and I know that you have a faith yourself, and I guess you're a psychologist and you have a faith, and I'm really interested to know how did you get there, and what difference does having a faith make to you in your life?
Yeah, I actually, before I say that, I mean, that the course and the opportunity to do that is such a great opportunity in this time. And I think the challenges of life and stress and emotional health so often, you can think about life as a bit like trying to get a boat across a lake. And there's two things that happen. One is that we sail into storms, and boy, has this been a stormy time. But the other is that we all do have some leaks in our boat. There are patterns and ways that we think, or things like you were talking about, boundaries, things that we learned when we were younger, all sorts of things in our personality that we all have Achilles heels. And as adults, mostly we don't think about those things. And so opportunities to process that, to try and think, well, actually, how am I living? They help us, because we can then become aware of something that maybe we would want to change or do differently. And in this time when so much is changing and things are unusually chaotic, that is such a good way of managing change, to find those spaces. So I think it's something like that, where you can have the opportunity just to pause and ponder, like you say, to have some headspace, to have some stillness is brilliant, aside of any sort of faith perspective or life perspective. And one of the advantages of stillness and meditation is that it gives you the space to do that, which is very important. I mean, yeah, so I mean, for me, faith has definitely had a huge impact for me in life in general, but in seasons like this when things are difficult and unpredictable, because I think for me it helps me understand a lot of the bigger questions that can underlie something like this. I mean, even as a psychologist, that just understanding how were we designed as people? Like, why do things like human connection matter so much? Why has this season been so stressful, so hard? And understanding how human beings were made to need one another. Some of the basics about the DNA of who we are. And for me, understanding that in the context of how we're built, the Bible says that we reflect the nature of God, some of those patterns. So I think that understanding of big themes, but also just that bigger perspective, in a moment where, like I say, we as humans, we love to live under the illusion that everything's certain and predictable and everything's basically okay. And in moments like this, we're thrown into a reality that just shows how tenuous and how vulnerable we are. Life is. So many of the things that we depend upon are. What do you depend upon? What are the constancies, the certainties? And for me, faith offers me something there, both in terms of something I can depend on, that I always know will be there. I can always turn to God. There's this ancient song, one of the Psalms, that says that I know that God is right beside me. I will not be shaken because God is right beside me. And that's definitely a reality. It's something that I can turn to, that will always be there. But also just something that brings a better story, a bigger story, a different perspective, in seasons like this where it can feel so grim. I mean, gosh, right. I don't know if anybody else watching feels that, but I'm having moments right now where I just think, oh man, it's just so relentlessly grim. And it feels, you hear things like they're talking about, maybe we'll get this vaccine, maybe we'll get this treatment, but it's not going to be for months. And you just think, oh man, this is dark. And to have a sense of a bigger story, a better story, a bigger promise, remembering that there is always light and life and hope and goodness in the world. And ultimately, for me, believing that there's a God story that's involved in that stuff, and that we get to play a part. What's our purpose in this mess that we're in right now? I love, there's a verse in the New Testament that talks about how when we step into things and we do good things, or we step into bringing light or bringing life or bringing hope, that we become like God's handiwork. But the actual original Greek word that's used there is the same as the Greek word for poetry, and so there's a translation of that says literally, we have become God's poetry. And I love that thought in the dark moments, that everything can be going wrong, the whole world can be in chaos, but I can still make a decision to become part of a better song, a better poem that is being spoken. It is there, Sometimes you just have to look really hard for it. And sometimes in the darkest moments, actually, they are the moments that that light and that better song and better poem does shine through. It does sing out. And I love that context that I understand because of the faith and the understanding that some of the Bible teaching and stuff gives me.
Wow, that's really inspiring. And if you have heard Kate and are interested at all in spirituality, God, just exploring, is there more to life than this? Can a belief, a faith in God help me day to day with stress, like all of this? Then I would just so highly recommend trying an Alpha course, which we've at Christchurch have got one starting on Tuesday the 22nd of September and one the week after on Tuesday the 29th of September. And an Alpha course is really an opportunity to watch a short video and then have a discussion on the video. So you do not need to come believing in God in any way. You can totally come in thinking, nope. And it's just a discussion. So we just like a really kind of open conversation. And what we tend to find on these courses is that the people going tend to make really good friends with each other. And there's a community that's built, which is really, really lovely. And I think particularly at the moment, with lots of people being in their homes, feeling isolated, then an opportunity to make some friends is a really great one. So if you are interested in exploring more, then there's information on our website, and I think the link should be coming up for you. But you'd be so welcome to join. And you can always just come to the first one. And if you don't like it, then you really don't have to come back. So I'd highly recommend it. I've done Alpha a few times, and each time I learn something new, and I just find it really interesting hearing the views of other people. And I think sometimes I get a bit bored with small talk, or, you can see friends, which is nice, but sometimes it's really nice to have those meaty conversations. And that's definitely what this is. So I would really encourage you to come if you're at all interested. Kate, we have got 3 minutes left. I would just love any final thoughts that you can give us, any pearls of wisdom. And maybe kind of looking ahead to the next few months, like we don't know if there's going to be another lockdown. We don't know what change is coming, but what words of wisdom could you leave us with?
So I think my words of wisdom would just a final take home message to remember the impact that overwhelm has on your mind, on your ability to handle that moment well. I think because otherwise, if you don't recognize that, then you add to the panic of that moment. And I'll just end with a really classic thing that lots of people are struggling with right now, which is making difficult decisions. So many people, what they're finding is they've got to make a difficult decision. Do I do something? Don't I do it? How do I handle this situation? Whatever. And what they find is the minute they start to think about it, whoosh, up goes their stress level. They're totally into overwhelm. One of the things that happens in that space is your thinking mind gets turned right down. It's almost like your brain's on like act now, think later mode. It's like, now is not the time for thinking, just get out, and so quite often what that means is that you get even more panic because I've got this decision to make and I can't do it. But actually the problem there is not your ability to make the decision. The problem is managing the stress and the overwhelm of that moment. So simple things, separate the two. Have a moment where you try and fact find and like brainstorm, and again putting on paper, writing down all the facts, but you're under no pressure to make the decision, because that will mean that your analytical mind will function better. And then at a totally different time, try and make the decision, involve other people, get someone to sit down with you and talk it through, because that will drop your stress level. But most of all, it's about awareness and not panicking. This is not a sign that you are losing it or a failure as a basic human being. It is a sign that you are a human being, though, and you have limits, and this is a tough season. So I think we can all be compassionate. We can be compassionate to one another, which is really good. So in a time when there's a lot of conflict around, let's try and be a bit less reactive. Try and remember everybody is in a different situation to us. But we can also be compassionate to ourselves. Give yourself a break. Maybe what you need is an evening off, the chance to get out and go for a long walk, or watch that utterly ridiculous box set that is going to be a totally wasted 4 hours of your life. Except it's not wasted, because if you can drop your stress level, you will improve the way that you cope with everything else that life is going to throw at you. So that 4 hours of doing nothing could be the best 4 hours you've done all month.
Thank you so much for giving us permission to switch off. I really needed that. Okay, it's been so wonderful to chat to you. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom. And we can find you at Mind and Soul Foundation, the website, can't we? And just quickly, just tell everyone about your the Headstrong that you've got.
Yeah, if you've got teens and young people in your life or in your house, or if you're a teen or young person yourself watching, then check out beheadstrong.uk. It's a brand new online space that we've just launched. We launched it on the 1st of September, which is talking about how do you do life really well, particularly in challenging times. We've got real life stories from people. We've got fun stuff you can do to help distract you, to help you relax as an antidote. There's a space where young people can send in their own questions. It's just a really relaxed, fun space to have these type of conversations. And there is lots of stuff specific to this weird and wonderful season and how to help you get through it better, particularly as schools are going back and there's a whole world of stuff. We could talk for another hour and how all that is, couldn't we?
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. It's been wonderful having you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lou.